My name is Bob Wood. I'm with AFC International, and on behalf of USNI and AFC International, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's presentation. Near-peer competition, what are we doing differently to acquire and sustain systems? We're very happy to have with us a distinguished panel that can speak very specifically by systems to this question, and a great moderator. Thank you for being here. Reminder that cell phones, put them on stun, if you would please, and questions can be asked at the microphones you see in the aisles as we get to that point of the program. This goes from 2:30 to 3:45, so I think we have a good time for a discussion and presentations on the subject at hand. This panel is sponsored. I'd like to thank that sponsor. We are indeed happy to have our sponsors in support of all of our operations and activities here. Lockheed Martin is a sponsor for this afternoon's session. They are represented here today by Doug Laurendeau, Vice President for Business Development. Doug, are you here? Probably back at the booth you'll see on the floor. Scott Craig, Director, Strategy and Business Development, and Dave Steindl, Director, Navy Marine Corps Programs. Thank you to Lockheed Martin. I appreciate your support. As we know, it wouldn't be made, we couldn't do this without their support. Well, we couldn't do this panel without the panel we've got in front of us, and I'd like to start by introducing our moderator. Our moderator is Rear Admiral Nevin Carr, U.S. Navy retired, Vice President and Navy Strategic Account Executive at Leidos and former Chief of Naval Research as he completed his service in the Navy. He retired in 2012 following a 34-year career, a variety of commands to include the Arleigh Burke, the USS Cape St. George, a host of planning and programming activities across the board, surface fleet, ballistic missile, defense systems, a host of activities understanding the mechanics of planning and programming and putting programs into the systems that are defending our nation. His last job as the Chief of Naval Research, he was working with 4,000 talented scientists and engineers, it says. So you were translating operating needs into the engineering specifics. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel and Admiral Carr to the stage.
Thank you very much, Bob, and welcome to the panel where we're going to talk about how we acquire and for this group primarily sustain systems for our services in a time where we're swinging the rudder from the good old days of the last 20 years to near-peer competition. Seems to me that that as these gentlemen have managed their enterprises, they're always driven by change. What's different now is that the rate of change is changing, and it's changing due to different stimulus, some inside, some outside. Clearly on the outside, we're being stimulated, driven to change by this migration to a more near-peer mindset, and that has implications for how they do what they do. But we're also being stimulated from the inside, and by recent tragedies that I'm sure you all are very familiar with. It changes some of the way we think about how we produce readiness, and people are part of that system too, not just the machines. The format today will have about 6 to 7 minutes each for our panelists, and that'll leave us about a half hour for your questions, which is the real important part. Going alphabetically from left to right, on my left, Rear Admiral Boris Becker, commander of the Space and Naval Warfare Systems Command, where he leads 10,000 talented civilian and military personnel. He's a native of New York City, began his career flying EA-6B Prowlers, and in his previous flag assignments was PEO C4I and Space Systems. He's an aerospace engineering duty officer and a member of the Space Cadre with a master's from George Washington and was a federal executive fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. To his left, Vice Admiral Paul Grosklags, commander of Naval Air Systems Command, providing full life cycle support of naval aviation aircraft, weapons, and systems for our sailors, but also for our Marines. He's served multiple flag tours. He was the commander of the Fleet Readiness Centers, assistant commander for logistics and industrial operations, NAVAIR Vice, PEOA, and principal military deputy to ASNRDA Sean Stackley. He had acquisition tours, including engineering, test pilot, and multiple H-60 assignments as the MH-60R Deputy Program Manager and the Program Manager for Multi-Mission Helicopters. Vice Admiral Tom Moore is the 1981 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He's an engineering duty officer, but before that, he was a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer for 13 years. He was the Director of Fleet Readiness, OPNAV N-43, and Program Executive Officer for Aircraft Carriers, currently serving as the 44th Commander of the Naval Sea Systems Command. Brigadier General Joe Schrader on his left, the Commander of the Marine Corps Systems Command, MARCOR SYSCOM. He's the Senior Acquisition Officer for the Commandant of the Marine Corps. He began his career as an enlisted grunt and became a Marine Artillery Officer. His career included multiple combat tours, Marine Corps Recruit Depot Series Command, command of the 5th Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company, and over 10 years in acquisitions, from project officer to program manager to his current command at MARCOR SYSCOM. And last but certainly not least, representing the Coast Guard, Rear Admiral Jack Vogt, Assistant Commandant for Response Policy. He's responsible for the development of strategic policy and doctrine in the areas of law enforcement, search and rescue, port security, defense operations, oil spill response, and incident management. As a member of the Coast Guard's Acquisition Executive Oversight Council, he establishes requirements across the full range of acquisition programs supporting Coast Guard response activities. We have a wonderfully rich panel today. I won't delay any further, but hand right over to Admiral Becker. Look forward to your comments and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the time. We have 9 to 12 minutes, you said? Well, somebody's awake out there anyway.
You've already used 1.5 of them.
Yeah. You're not all suffering from FLOC, food-induced loss of consciousness. The topic of this is, in short, how do we make sure that they don't catch up and how do we stay ahead? It's kind of a poor man's version, I think, of the thesis. And I think to start with that, maybe we spend 45 seconds talking about what the problem is. How many were here for the DepSecDefs conversation? How about anybody here at the SDMAC breakfast with CNO? Only a couple, so I can make that part up. The problem statement is that we are in a time of strategic competition. And if you didn't walk away with anything else from some of the conversations with the senior leaders in the department this week, that's the one you want to take away. Strategic competition. And SecDef says we need to go after that with a couple of 3 ways. Increase our lethality with our readiness and our modernization, expand our allies and partners with our allies and partners, and then reform how we do business. The CNO kind of takes that and says, all right, well, what do we need to do to provide the Navy that our nation needs? And there's kind of 6 degrees of freedom there, if you will. We need a bigger Navy, a better Navy, a networked Navy, a talented Navy, an agile Navy, and a Navy that's ready. So I'm going to focus for a little bit on that networked Navy. The fact that we need a networked Navy in order to compete and win in a strategic competition. And I'd argue that you need a networked Navy as a fundamental entrance into even the concept of a bigger and better Navy. Yeah, we good with that? Yeah. Hua? I didn't get any huas. I got one hua.
It's an Army
All right.
thing.
It is an Army thing. Hua? Means everything except no. So how do we get to a networked Navy? How do we do something different to acquire and sustain the capabilities that we need for a networked Navy, and a networked Navy that also reaches out to our allies and partners? And I suggest that it's not just about sustainment of what's there today and the legacy capabilities, but the way that we need to sustain capabilities that move at the pace of information technology is, in fact, to modernize. Because the dollars that we spend on sustaining legacy systems are dollars that we move more slowly into modernizing. Now, that's not to say, and I saw Dietrich here somewhere, that's not to say we could just unprogram all the dollars we have for sustainment. We can't do that because we don't have the modernization there in time to pick it up. So how do we change that curve? I think that's fundamental to how we get to that networked, better, and bigger Navy, is to look at the model of moving faster in the information technology domain inside our Navy, inside the Don with our partners in the maritime, and across our allies and partners. That's how we look to get and maintain our edge in this strategic competition. And we can talk, at the tactical level about different kinds of contracting strategies and how we move faster. And we can have that conversation here amongst a couple hundred of our closest friends. We can have that on sidebars. We can admire that problem a lot. Or we can really knuckle down and think about the opportunity that we have. With this DepSecDef driving the reform that the SecDef says we need, and when we look inside our wheelhouse in the Don, the Secretary of the ASN RDNA, Secretary Gertz, coming from SOCOM, he wants to move fast. He wants to take advantage of all the authorities that we have today in existing law, regulation, and policy. We have the opportunity to figure out how to move faster. And from my world at SPAWAR, everybody say it with me, SPAWAR, not SPA war, SPAWAR like in space, we have to move with that speed. Because if we don't, we will not be able to afford to sustain what's in legacy. And that legacy capability will not be what the platforms under the sea, on the sea, and in the air need in order to provide that network Navy that is better and bigger than anybody else can put to sea. That's about my 5 minutes. I yield the rest of my time to my colleagues to the left.
Excellent. I'll use every second of it. Okay, so Boris already made the case for the competitive environment that we're living in, working in, that our sailors and Marines are facing every day. So what is NavAir doing to address that? And so our strategic approach to this is really built around what we fundamentally do at NavAir. And my leadership team hates it when I do this, but if you cut it down to brass tacks, we only do two things. We buy stuff and we sustain the stuff that we bought and put in the fleet. So that's where we started. And we said in order to be more competitive, we have to, one, be able to deliver new capabilities to the sailors and Marines much more quickly than we do today. And two, once we deliver those products, we got to be able to sustain them in a proactive vice the current reactive mode, which has resulted in, by any measure, readiness being less than what we need it to be. So we said, okay, well, those two strategic priorities sound pretty good. Now, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to operationalize those things? And we said, well, one thing we got to look at is we believe that we have to make fundamental changes. We don't believe that we can get after this by nibbling around the edges. We don't think that we can find another 5% or 2% or even 10% efficiency. We have to make fundamental changes to the way we do those two things, buying things and sustaining things. And so what we've embarked on are two things. The first one we're calling capabilities-based acquisition. And I'll talk about that in a second. And the second one is Sustainment Vision 2020. Now, each one of those normally would entail about a 45-minute presentation by myself, which I've done recently at NDIA and ASNI and other forums. And we'd be happy to do that, but Tom would get upset if I took his time, and he'd already been asleep. So let me give you just a thumbnail sketch on each one. Capabilities-based acquisition is about really starting with the integration and interoperability step before we start anything on an acquisition program. It's sitting down with the operators and determining what are the ConOps, the ConEMs, and the kill chains that they're trying to solve with this new capability, this new thing that we're going to try and bring into the field. And we do that in a model-based environment to start with because that's all we have. We don't have the widget, right? We don't have the threat stuff, so we do it in a model-based environment. But then typically what we do today is we turn that all in, all that information then turns into a big, thick requirements document, which turns into big, thick specification, which we give the industry, and it becomes a paper environment. And what we're trying to do is take that entire chain and turn it into a model-based environment from day one in this I&I, integration and interoperability work, all the way through design and development with our industry brothers and sisters, into our test and evaluation process, where we will start with what comes out of design and development first, the constructive environment. The second thing that comes out is the virtual environment. And the final thing that comes out is the actual live product. So we've built the constructive virtual live. Some people like to call that LVC, but they got it out of order. But the fact is that we can then take that model-based environment, development environment, and give it to our operators to train with in an LVC environment on day one. So that model-based thread has to go all the way from the beginning of a program, even before we write down that first big R or little r in requirements, all the way to the time we provide a training solution with the fielded solution to our operators. That's what we're calling capabilities-based acquisition, and we're underway on that. If we do that correctly, that digital representation of the system and how it operates in that model-based environment is then exactly what we need to take it in to Vision 2020, Sustainment Vision 2020. And without getting into the details of this, let me just give you the visualization of what we believe we need to have in Sustainment Vision 2020. Think about a sustainment operations center, where a small group of decision makers and a small group of analysts have at their fingertips the status of every single aircraft we have in the fleet, 24/7. They know where it is, they know what its operational schedule looks like, they know what its maintenance requirements are today, but more importantly, they know what the maintenance requirements are going to be 7 days from now, 30 days from now, 90 days from now. They know what the aircraft is telling us in terms of what components are wearing out and when we might have to replace them. They know where the support equipment, the maintenance professionals, and the supply system parts are needed to perform that maintenance in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And they've got that package ready to go. And if you think that sounds like a pipe dream, ask American, Delta, or they don't exist anymore, do they? United, how do they do it when they manage their fleets? They do it through an operations center. Ask NetJets, ask PHI, Petroleum Helicopters International. How do they do it? They do it this way because to them, it's about money. It's about maintaining their competitive edge in the financial world. We can do the exact same thing. We need to do the exact same thing. So those are the two things we decided we need to do, CBA and Vision 2020. And then we took a step back and said, okay, that all sounds good, it looks good, we can pat ourselves on the back, but is that really what the fleet needs? Is that really going to make the fleet more competitive? What do they really need? And we decided that they really want 4 things on day one when we deliver that new capability. And I'd argue it's the same thing you all want when you get a new car, or you move into a new house, or whatever that big purchase is. The first thing you want to know is, how does it work? Has it been fully characterized? What can it do? What can't it do? We do that pretty well. In fact, maybe we overdo our testing sometimes. The second thing we do poorly, which is making sure that when that thing shows up in your driveway on day one, it's fully integrated and interoperable with the stuff it's supposed to be integrated and interoperable with. Our system is not designed to build things that way today. Our funding, our programs, everything is built by widget by widget by widget, and then we go, hey, fleet, tie all these things together when we give them to you in the end. And that's where Boris comes in and tries to network all these things together after the fact. If we do model-based systems engineering correctly, we'll have that built into the system from day one. The third thing we do poorly today is delivering a capability that they can fully train with on day one. We just don't give it to them. We try and build it in after the fact. Again, capabilities-based acquisition can provide that on day one. And then the fourth thing that they want is that when it shows up on day one, is sustainable. They've got the tools in place so that they and we supporting them can sustain that piece of equipment in a proactive manner rather than reacting every time it breaks or something unexpected goes wrong. So we looked at what we think the fleet needs to be more competitive and said, yes, we think CBA and Vision 2020 can get us there. That's the path we're on. This is not a technology challenge, folks. It is not. It's about culture. It's about alignment of resources. It's about alignment of people. It's about a relationship with industry. We can't do this in the way we operate today with industry. We just can't. So I've probably used my time and your time. I'll leave it at that and look forward to your questions.
Okay.
Tom?
Hey, thanks, G8. So you're probably gonna hear some pretty similar themes here to what Boris and G8 talked about. They hit on the same topics in a little different approach. I'm gonna kind of take the two same approach, but talk about it a little bit differently. I do think, back to the opening comment, we are in an era of great power competition, and the question of what are we doing differently is important today. Just a kind of a sidebar. I've never quite understood why we call it SPAY war, because we don't call it Nave C either. So I don't know. It just seems to me
I'm
that
not
SPA
sure why you're
wars
wrong.
is better. So let me just take a look at this on two elements. On the acquisition side of the house, and then let me talk, which is kind of the, in the 6 elements of naval power that the CNO is talking about, is kind of the bigger and better Navy. And then I also want to touch base on the readiness side of the house, which is really the kind of the more ready Navy, which is one of the other 6 elements here. So clearly on the acquisition side, I think what you're seeing inside the Beltway right now, one, and they've touched on it already, we've got a new Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Secretary Gertz comes from a background at SOCOM, which is a lot more agile and a lot, delivers capability to the warfighter a lot faster than perhaps we're used to in systems commands today. So there are a lot of things that we can learn from the way SOCOM's doing it, and I think we're going to try and embrace that. And you're already seeing that in some of the things that he's trying to do in terms of busting down the bureaucracy and pushing some of the decision-making down to lower levels than it's at today. And we embrace that, and we welcome that going forward. We're not going to become more agile unless we can do that. Second, I think you're going to watch, it's going to be interesting to see what the new ATNL, now ex-ATNL organization looks like, and how that organization interacts with the individual services, and then down to the SysComs themselves. I think there's a great opportunity for us as we work through some of the things that are in the latest NDAA that will give us the opportunity to be a lot more agile than we are today. On the NAVSEA side of the house, the 10 warfare centers that work for me on the undersea side and the surface warfare side, they are really the tip of the spear for me in terms of agile acquisition. That is where most of the S&T and the rapid prototyping is going on right now. And so I would agree, with Admiral Gross colleagues here, the key is as we go do a lot of the things we're doing in the warfare centers today, whether it's unmanned, above the surface, below the surface, on the surface, mine countermeasure, counter UAS, all the things that we're working on. How do we integrate that into the bigger ship platforms that we have today so that when we introduce this technology, the users are ready to go? The last piece of the acquisition part, which is not so much what are we doing differently, because while we have the new frigate out there today that we're looking at, the shipbuilding plan as it's laid out, the only difference I think you're going to see in shipbuilding over the next 5 to 10 years is we're going to build more. Now that's important. That falls into the kind of that quantity has a quality all of its own. And so all the things that I touched on the acquisition side of the house, I think they are important to the ability of us to grow the size of the force. So if you want to know what's different and what are we going to do in terms of making sure that we can compete in this great era of great power competition, from my perspective from the Naval Sea Systems Command, it's build more ships. And we don't necessarily have to build different ships than we're building today, but we certainly need more of them going forward. And so that's kind of an emphasis that's on my plate. On the readiness side of the house, let me talk about a couple things. Readiness remains, the on-time delivery of ships and submarines out of maintenance availabilities remains the Naval Sea Systems Command #1 priority, because you can't have readiness if we don't have ships out there to execute their mission. And so our ability to get ships into and out of maintenance availabilities, whether they're in the public shipyards for our nuclear submarines or aircraft carriers, or whether they're in the private sector, is critically important. The last year, about this time, there was an article in I think the Washington Post that the United States Navy had a period without an aircraft carrier at sea for the first time since before World War II. And that was a pretty startling article when you read it. And the reason that we faced that challenge was because we were down to 10 carriers, so a quantity issue there. And we had an aircraft carrier, the George H.W. Bush, which was supposed to be in an 8-month availability, that took 13 months. And so because we were not able to get the ship out on time, we provided limited options to the combatant commanders and to the CNO, one of which was either compress the training of the crew of the George H.W. Bush before she went into harm's way. Not a good choice. 2, we could have extended the U.S. Dwight D. Eisenhower, which was there already, on a 9-month deployment for an additional 5 months. that wasn't a good choice, or we could choose to take a gap. None of them great choices. At the end of the day, we decided to take a gap. So going forward, in particular, as we start to grow the size of the force, it's important to grow the size of the force, but it's also critically important that on the readiness side of the house that we have the capacity in both our naval shipyards and in the private sector to actually get the throughput necessary to get these ships to in and out of these maintenance availabilities on time so that we can give the warfighter time to train before they deploy. And there's a whole host of things on the plate right now that NAVC is working on in terms of how do we optimize the naval shipyards, how do we set them up to be 21st century naval shipyards. Most of the naval shipyards were built, some of them built before the turn of the 20th centuries. At the time, they were designed to build new ships, and how you do build new ships and how you maintain ships is a completely different manufacturing process. And so we've put a concerted effort into looking at the 4 naval shipyards and what do we have to do differently in terms of investments in the yard and how we lay these yards out so that we can get the throughput that we need. And then similarly, there's the same process on the private sector side of the house that we've got to go look at the BAEs and the NASCOs and all the great companies that are doing private sector repair work for us on the surface ship side of the house. We've got to make sure that we've got the capacity necessary to go do the maintenance. That's a key component of the readiness equation, and we won't get the ready Navy that we need that's part of the 6 elements of naval power unless we can do that. So with that, I will cede the floor to my Marine Corps friend to my left.
Hoorah.
Hoorah.
It's a Marine thing, sir.
Means everything, including no.
Exactly. So I'm just going to talk to you about 3 areas. 2 of them pertain to how we're going to acquire differently, not necessarily new. I think what you'll hear me talk about is kind of back to the future, things that the Marine Corps did some 10, 15, 20 years ago, and we're kind of resurrecting them with a couple of new twists. And then the last point is how we're sustaining, doing some things there differently. The first point that I would bring out is faster requirements generation through experimentation and S&T. And the way that we're doing that is it's an old idea. It's something that the Marine Corps used to do years ago through experimentation with the warfighting lab through exercises called Sea Dragon. We resurrected that. We did one last year with a focus on ship-to-shore maneuver, mostly looking at unmanned systems. We did it here at Camp Pendleton. And just a real quick synopsis, we put out working with AS and RDA, specifically DAS and RDT&E, we put out a BAA and said this is what we're looking to do, enhance or improve our ship-to-objective or ship-to-shore maneuver through unmanned systems. We had 50 to 100 systems from industry and from the warfare centers came and played in this, and we identified some systems that we were able to then put some contracts in place for some small number of them. Did a little bit more experimentation through exercise Sea Dragon, which was done recently with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines out of 31st MU. And the idea is we call that down to even some more, if you will, that we see promise in, and then we put them into an exercise. The exercise that we used was Bold Alligator. So what will come out of that, hopefully, is either we'll go ahead and buy some systems that are ready for fielding that we think should be fielded, put them out to the operating forces, or we use what we learned through that experimentation with 3.5 and we feed that back into our requirements generate a requirement, shoehorn it into the POM where appropriate, into hopefully a program of record. So it's you got to deal with the new start thing there, but hopefully back into the program of record, and then over to us at Systems Command or the PEO so we can start buying it. So faster requirements generation through experimentation and S&T. So like I said, in 2017, last year, we did S2ME2, which was ship to objective. In 2018, the focus is going to be on logistics. We're going to do it again with a focus on logistics, primarily unmanned logistics. And then in 2019, we're looking at the Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations, EABO, which is outlined in the Marine Corps' operating concept. So over the next 2 years, we think it's got sustainment. Last year, we were able to obligate about roughly about $7 or $8 million into some systems. We're continuing to work that, working with the right folks on the Hill to get it funded, give us some fungible dollars to do that. The second area I would say that I would talk to you about is faster acquisitions. It's just getting on contract faster. But to me, it's culture. It's really culture. And a couple of the admirals talked about our new ASNRDA, Secretary Gertz, Hondo. His call sign is Hondo. I guess that's his call sign, but he goes by Hondo. And he's coming from SOCOM. And, I went down there several years ago and talked to him about what's the secret sauce down here at SOCOM about moving fast. And I sat and listened to him, and it was really all about, he said, it's the culture. It's the culture of getting the acquisition side lined up with the operators, hand in hand, just like the Admiral talked about, and moving out in lockstep, not this identify the requirement, kick it over the fence to the acquisition guys, and then come back if there's trades and discuss all that. It's moving out at the same time to do that. It's a mindset. So how are we really getting at the culture, though? And the Admiral talked about Mr. Gertz wanting to push things down, delegate as much down as he can. Specifically, he's talking about milestone decision authority, pushing that down to PEOs, pushing it down to my level. A lot of that's already done. The second thing that he's charged us with is being willing to take risk. We have to put that back into the acquisition workforce. Now, I tell you, that's a real challenge, because the process that we're in, because you got to get the requirement right, and then you got to take the requirement and generate the performance specification. Then from the performance spec, you got to come up with evaluation criteria, and all this has to be done so that it can withstand a protest, so on and so forth. And what that really does is that drives back into our workforce a risk-averse mindset. So we're going to have to tell them, you got to worry about those things. We got to cross our T's and dot our I's, but at the same time, we got to be willing to take risk. And then the last thing goes back to Secretary Gertz in this space, which is he has really asked us to take a look at, do we need to use ACAT 3 and 4 for our programs? What he's really asking there, it's not about ACAT 3s and 4s, but it's really a cultural thing in that, especially where I work, most of our stuff is small dollar programs, and we have a lot of ACAT 4s and some ACAT 3s, and they're all treated like there's a tendency to treat it like it's an ACAT 1 program. And so when the folks in the program offices try to do this thing called tailoring, they start with a whole list of things and try to figure out what they don't need instead of starting with nothing and tailor in what you do need to make it happen. And so that leads you to the question of, do we really need all the trappings of an ACAT 3 and 4 program that are really coming out of ACAT 1 and 2 like programs? So it's a culture thing. And then the last thing is in sustainment. And again, this is not a new idea. It's starting with the logistics strategy before you even start designing, or you have to design in the logistics strategy so that the system you're designing is sustainable in the long run, especially for us. If you look at a lot of our platforms, the tank, the LAV, the MTVR, 20, 30-year platforms. So the cost is not up front, the cost is downstream in sustainment. So you have to design that up front. What are we doing to get after that? Within the command, through the reorganization that we're doing, we have combined systems engineering and acquisition logistics together. We put them under the same roof. And so that those acquisition logisticians, not bean bullets and Band-Aids logisticians, but acquisition logisticians are working with our engineers, with our systems engineers, to design in sustainment into that system up front. Hopefully it'll prove itself out. And the last thing in that area is we have to get after conditions-based maintenance versus time-based maintenance. And that's an old idea, but we have to get after it. And it's exactly what I think Admiral Grosskлагs was talking about, being able to do predictive maintenance based on sense and respond technologies that you build into your platforms. So those are the three areas. I'll just recap: rapid requirements development through experimentation and S&T. getting on contract faster through changing the culture, taking risks, being willing to take risk, and with the objective of not satisfying the process, but yet satisfying getting on contract fast. And then the last one is building in sustainment up front in the design of the system. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Coast Guard.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and pleasure to be here today. I think my panel colleagues have done a great job of really covering the acquisition and sustainment part of this issue set that we're discussing. So I'm offer a quick C story and then a quick comment on requirements. So the C story. The morning after the Coast Guard initiated search and rescue operations after the passage of Hurricane Harvey, my team put together amazing PowerPoint briefings for the Commandant and the Vice Commandant and the National Command Center the next day. And at the conclusion of that fantastic, amazing brief, the Commandant goes, "Great, Admiral Vogt, but I have no idea what's going on right now." Took that to heart a little bit, and we made our PowerPoints a little bit better. We told a little bit more. Had some prettier pictures, and the next morning, after our team finished our great brief, the Commandant, and this time with the Vice Commandant with a little glare behind it, said, "Admiral Vogt, wonderful, but I don't know what's going on right now." So being a little smart, I got together with my colleagues in the legal community, the contracting authority for the U.S. Coast Guard, and our cybersecurity, our system security experts to go, what can we do now to ensure that our Commandant, Vice Commandant know what's happening now relative to Coast Guard operations supporting Hurricane Harvey. And the next morning, after probably concluded about 1 a.m. that night, we presented a COTS system that we rapidly put in place, put on our system architecture, with all the checks and boxes, and so that the next morning the Commandant, Vice Commandant walked in, and on the screen was a geospatial plot, a heat map plot of where we were receiving calls for service, rescuing people, asset tracking, where we were taking those people. The long story short on that, relative to requirements, I didn't go through a complicated ORD. I got with the people who were able to make decisions to help our team out, to give our senior leaders the information they needed to make decisions moving forward. And it took the service chief to just set the requirement and everyone else falling in line with that requirement to move us forward to really employ a unique capability and a unique way to acquire that capability and put it online literally in less than 24 hours. So that brings us back to the Coast Guard requirements development process, like our sister services and certainly other elements of DoD, is a standardized, repeatable process. I'll apply some terms, and it's necessary in that context for major acquisition. I'll call it capital acquisitions, like our own national security cutter, our new fast response cutters, our C-130J programs. It's methodical, it's research and developed based, and it's effective. And please keep those terms in mind when you think of our Deputy Secretary for Defense, Mr. Shanahan, when he went over the National Defense Strategy and talked about the need for reform, and the terms he employed were speed, innovation, efficiency, and we heard a lot of dialogue on that already. So I think for these major capital acquisitions, the tried and true model works quite well, but when it comes to rapid technology insertion, we need to think differently. We need to embrace those terms that were presented by the DepSec and employ speed over methodology, innovation, experimentation over a long, drawn-out research and development program, and I think efficiency over effectiveness. Can we employ an 80% solution, knowing that in 3 to 4 years or in even a shortened duration, that the technology we're employing is already going to be out of date? So we've heard Secretary Gert's name mentioned a number of times. He's speaking tomorrow. Had the opportunity to brief him on some of our initiatives, and pretty excited about what he will bring from SOCOM, what Hondo will bring from SOCOM as a model of rapid and affordable acquisitions and helping us move forward in this program. So with that, thank you.
Well, thank you. I have to admit, I have never been on a panel, and most panels that I've been on have been over on this side. I've never been on one where everybody's stuck to the timeline. But congratulations to all of you. I think they should get a panel bonus check for that. So we do have time for questions, and while you're thinking about them, I'll start off with one. My background on shore duty was largely in the requirements world, the N8 Pentagon requirements world when I was not at sea. So I spent a lot of time working requirements and thinking about them. And it has really occurred to me that as the world is speeding up and the rate of change is changing, we spend an awful lot of time coming up with requirements that track backwards from a point threat out in the future somewhere that is unknowable. So how do you do that? How do you come up with requirements? And so, Admiral Grossklag, I was really intrigued by your thoughts on capability-based acquisition, and was wondering if you could talk a little about what would the connection be, what would the implications be for, the way we're stuck in the requirements loop sometime. How would that be different, shifting to what you're talking about with more of a capability, which I think is something we have to do. You want to talk about that one?
We've started this a little bit, particularly in the air-to-air environment, where we've been working on this for a number of years. And what we have today is a product called a NIC, and it's a Naval Integrated Capability. But the concept is truly what I stated. It's sitting down with the warfighters at the start, before we start writing down the requirements for a program, and looking at where are your capability gaps, specific to kill chains, because just putting a capability out there that is nice, it's shiny, it's got a lot of performance, if it doesn't fit in their con ops or their con amp, and it doesn't fill gaps in kill chains, then you have to ask yourself, it may look nice, it may be the shiniest new thing on the block, but what are we buying it for? And if we can go through that process up front and truly understand how they're going to use it, and then set the requirements in place, it not only will save us a lot of design and development headaches, quite honestly, it will also save us a tremendous amount of time as we try and go through the process of defining the requirements. And the other thing it gives us is the ability in this model-based environment to quickly make changes if those con ops or those con amps or the kill chain requirements change. Because we're not going to develop something over a 5-year period. Even if we could do it in 2 years, the threat changes, our own capabilities change. This gives us the ability to quickly revisit those requirements and see what impact does that have in a model-based environment very, very quickly, and then adjust the requirements documents real time to fix that. So that goes back to when I talk about this isn't just a little a acquisition thing in the systems commands. This gets to the whole JSIDS process and how long it takes us to get our requirements document in place, and who starts it and who finishes it. Right now it takes too long. It's not agile, it's not effective, and I shouldn't throw stones at the requirements folks. We've got plenty we can throw at our own house, but we got to get those two things together up front more closely.
Thank you. Okay. Sydney?
We can't hear you, Sydney. Can you turn the mic on? Is the mic on?
I'll just yell.
There
I'm
you
a
go.
There you
reporter.
go.
I'm loud. Question particularly about ANTX, et cetera. You mentioned a number of technologies have moved forward, and General Walsh mentioned this too, moved forward to other exercises like Bold Alligator, and then have moved forward even potentially to the POM. Can you give us a few examples of some of the technologies that have led the way there, that have graduated through these various levels and are getting close to some kind of acquisition?
Yeah, so it's. Come on. Can you take her? You got shorted out. Comm sucks. It's a Marine thing. Yeah, so that's a great question, because what you're getting at is what we always struggle with, which is moving something over into the POM process and into the program of record. TDK is what comes to mind. The tactical decision kits that was thought up by a corporal, basically out of 2nd Battalion 6 Marines. And it is now transitioning over into one of our programs of record within training systems. That's one of them. The challenge is lining up sustainment with when we buy those systems, because it's going at it from a different perspective and much faster. It's not the usual process that we go through to buy and field something. It's truly using experimentation, buy it, try it, and if you like it, then field it. And the fielding piece of it is a challenge, because we're having to back into a process that wasn't really designed for the buy it, try it, field it model. We've only done it 1 year. It's not yet mature. It's being done through our Rapid Capabilities Office within the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, although I'll tell you, it's being led by a colonel that's not an acquisition colonel over in the Warfighting Lab under Brigadier General Christian Wortman. But 90% of the team is staffed by acquisition professionals from within Marine Corps Systems Command, program managers, a lieutenant colonel, and then contracting officers. So it's not a real fulfilling answer, Sydney, to your question. We're still trying to figure that piece of it out. But it has the potential, I think, to grow into something much larger. And it's really about, earlier I was thinking through how to describe it in terms of a kill chain, in terms of an acquisition kill chain. And it's really a new way of getting at that kill chain, using experimentation, concept to experimentation, and then buying it and trying to get into a program of record. Next question.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Lieutenant Commander Ty, USS Boxer. My question goes to the contrast between, as an example, naval control systems and information technology systems. You've got NAVSEA on one side, SPAWAR on the other side, both of which are tackling the cybersecurity concerns of all of these systems, but are tackling them separately. Is there a drive that you know of, or has there been any coordination towards developing common tools so that a ship's cybersecurity forces can focus in one location to track the security of their systems?
Yes. Next question.
Yeah, I mean, I think
absolutely.
the boundaries are very well understood. NAVSEA owns the ship control system, the combat system, and SPAWAR owns the IT portion of it. So that's pretty simple for us to then work the enclaves and the rules. But we're working off a very similar rule set and working off a very similar set of tools. And we do share knowledge across the systems command on a regular basis on how we go combat the threat. So I think it's probably laid out the way the boundaries are laid out today makes sense. There was some thought, hey, maybe we should turn cyber for the entire ship over to one person. I think that in the 2 years that I've been in the job, I've come to the conclusion that the way it's laid out today makes sense based on where the expertise for those particular systems lie. But to your point, a common set of tools for how we go about doing that makes sense. So if you want to add anything.
And I'm just having fun with you. Sorry about that, since my good shipmate to my left jumped in. The answer is absolutely yes, resounding yes. And while at SPAWAR, as the information technology technical authority as chartered by the Chief of Naval Operations, I don't have, nor do I want to maintain, expertise in hull mechanical and electrical systems or operational flight programs. We are responsible for developing and assisting in the implementation of cybersecurity standards, working in very close coordination with the chief engineers from the other SysComs who will have and will maintain the subject matter expertise in those areas. But we have to look at where some of those things do cross, from the combat systems where you have a real-time system that's going to ultimately send a firing pulse to a weapon that is somehow connected to, enabled by, and targeted with data that come from a command and control system that's tied to an ISR&T system, that's tied to a PNT system, that's running on a network that also attaches to your beans, bullets, and bandages. That is, I think, more complicated in today's environment, in part because the underlying information technology platforms themselves are very similar and come from the commercial world. So how should we approach that? And where should we look at the boundaries to make sure that we are operating as rapidly and sustaining as effectively and efficiently against potential adversaries in those commercial-based products as we need to? This is where the shameless plug comes in. please visit the Information Warfare Pavilion, where you can get your very own copy of the Spay War Vision for 2018 to 2027. And if you open it up to the center section, you will see the main thrusts of our strategic vision. An enabling aspect of that vision is implementing the information warfare platform. What is an information warfare platform? I don't have enough time, so go get the book and read it and find out.
Sean Heritage, I'm from the Defense Innovation Unit, experimental, up in Mountain View. You guys had said many things today that resonated with me, and I'm sure with the rest of the audience. There's 4 things, though, that I especially triggered on. One was your comments about culture. The other was your comment about partnerships with industry. The third was that of speed. And the fourth was requirements. And I just wanted to acknowledge that Hondo is a great American, and he's doing many great things to inspire change across the department. Some of this culture already lives at DIUX and elsewhere. We'd love to help you to scale that culture, move more quickly, partner with industry in ways that we haven't before. But I think that we move so quickly in partnership with customers because we don't do requirements. We do problem statements. And today, we're proud to announce that we did our 3rd production contract. This one was in support of Transcom to help lead the charge in the migration to the cloud. So I also wanted to acknowledge Admiral Grossglags, I'm sorry. You had commented that there were your organization had 2 jobs, delivering capability and sustaining capability. I would like to get your thoughts and the thoughts of others about what our respective jobs and responsibilities are with letting go of legacy, outdated capability. And then, since I am plugging the organization that I'm a part of, I also heard that about supply chain visualization management. We're doing work with a customer in DoD to do just that, much like Amazon and others do. And we're working with the Air Force to do predictive maintenance with the AWACS. We'd love to partner with other services to follow that.
Do you have a brochure? I'm just checking.
I do not.
Okay, so I'll try the outdated system or platforms, whatever you want to call it. First, I guess I need to acknowledge up front, that's really not our call. I mean, that's really a question for the fleet and the Sh1, the fleet commanders and the OpNav staff to determine when we should get rid of platforms that may have outlived their usefulness, either from a mission perspective or become prohibitively expensive. Our challenge is, as long as they're in the fleet, as long as we do have to sustain them, is to figure out how to do that in the most cost-effective manner while still ensuring that they are ready. I'll give you a great example that we're dealing with and have been dealing with for several years, and that's our legacy F-18s. Because of delays to other programs, we've kept them on the flight lines many years longer than we expected to, both the Navy and Marine Corps. And because of that, we had to invest a tremendous amount of resources in keeping them safely flyable. So, you know, king for a day, we would have said, hey, these airplanes can't live past 6,000 hours. They're done flying. But from an operationally realistic perspective, we can't do that. So it comes back to us and Tom on the ship side to figure out, well, how do we keep them operationally relevant until the Nest system comes online or until the warfighters say, yeah, we're done with that particular system. So that doesn't really answer your question, but our job is to keep the stuff in the fight as long as the warfighter wants to keep them out there.
Thank you, sir.
Anybody else want to address that? Dr. Tangradi.
Thank you, sir. After that advertisement and stuff, I'm going to try to pose something a little more challenging because General Schrader had opened up, and my colleague over there has opened up the question of Secretary Gertz and the culture of SOCOM and how it affects acquisition. Now, it is a common perception, maybe right, maybe wrong, that one of the reasons SOCOM has been so successful is because both Congress and the Joint Staff allows them to bend the rules. And that in this acquisition world, some of the standards that the services are held to, as far as dotting the I's and crossing the T's, doesn't necessarily apply to some special programs. Would you comment a bit about that? It seems that Congressional Budget Office or GAO will very readily audit a Navy acquisition program, but somehow won't do a SOCOM program. And so there is this perception that the rules that the services did not create is what holds them back. And the people that are being successful, whether it's DIUX or whatever, is because they don't quite obey them in the same way.
So I brought it up, so I'll be the first one. I would agree with what you just said. The only thing I'm going to tell you is I'm going to take the Secretary at his word, and we're going to challenge it. We're going to do what he said. I'm going to do the best that I can in what time I have left to change the culture and try to get the folks to take risk. What exactly that means, I'm not sure yet, to be honest with you, because we do run into having to cross the T and cross the T and cross the T and cross the T and so on and so forth. But you know, he said he wants to decentralize. He wants to intent-driven and decentralized execution. So, which is music to my ears. That's the way we operate. So we're going to take him at his word, and we're going to do the best that we can to try to meet what he's told us to do, and we'll see how it unfolds.
Yeah, I take a little bit different tack. I don't think it's SOCOM not following the rules so much as is the fact that we've created a level of bureaucracy that makes us a compliance-based organization, and I think there's a lot more flexibility in the rules than we're willing to push. So I think I'm not criticizing SOCOM. I think that the notion they've been allowed to get away with stuff, I think, is the wrong way to look at it. I think the way to look at it is they've accurately looked at the rules and used the flexibilities that are there and had a culture which allowed them to take a little bit more risk in the development of their systems. Now, they're not building $10 billion ships, so is the same level of oversight on a $10 million system, should they have the same level of oversight as you have on a $5 to $10 million ship or submarine? Probably not. So I think what he's getting after, which I'm all for, is to get out of being a completely compliance-based organization, follow some guiding principles, and use the flexibility that's in the FAR. And I think some of what you're seeing with the breakup of AT&L, and if you've listened to Secretary Lord, a significant downsizing for staff, some of that, we create some of that churn ourselves. So that's to whoever asked the question, that I think that there's a lot more flexibility here, and we have to get after it.
Yeah, I'd agree with Tom for a change. I don't think they bend the rules as much as they operate to the full extent of their authorities. And you can define that however you want. They also have a culture, again, it comes back to culture, of risk management. We have a culture in our acquisition system over the years that has become one of risk avoidance. And when I talk about culture, for me, it's as much about my organization, NavAir, as it is about the Secretariat, whether that's ASN or OSD or the Hill. So yeah, they hold us to standards. I got it. But we hold ourselves to plenty of other standards that we've put in place over time. As Tom noted, become more bureaucratic. It's to minimize risk. And we've been able to get away with that for the last 20 or 25 years, and it goes to the theme of this panel, because we weren't in a competitive environment. And now it's going to take a wrenching change to some of our folks who are very comfortable in that risk avoidance mentality to get them into a world where we need to operate, which is in risk management. So they do that better than we do today.
It was a common theme with Mr. Stackley, and when you were the principal military deputy, that he would often say that we have many of the authorities that we need. They're in place. We just need to use them to the full extent.
Hi, Megan Eckstein, U.S. Naval Institute News. So to stick with the theme of moving faster, obviously that could mean something a little bit different for all 5 of you, given your different portfolios. But when you look at something like the Marines MUX Group 5 UAS, I mean, that touches on 4 of your 5 portfolios. So how do you guys kind of optimize your operations so that you're being faster and more efficient, but not diverge too much so that you could still work together on something like MUX, which is kind of common to a few of you?
Is that for me?
We're all looking at you, so.
Yeah, so you're all looking at me. So MUX is over with Nav Air. I don't do things with rotors and wings, but I'll try to talk about it. I guess to keep us from moving apart, our commandant has made one of his number 1 priorities, which is naval integration. So that combined with the new organization that we put in place at Systems Command, which is organizing around to produce MAGTF products, commodity management, integration, commodity integration at the system level to produce a MAGTF piece of equipment. And so that's, I have asked, for example, our engineers, what does it mean to be a MAGTF engineer? You'll hear folks say, I'm a sub-engineer, I'm a this, but you don't hear anybody talk about I'm a MAGTF engineer. So I've challenged our chief engineer to tell me, what does that mean to be a MAGTF engineer from the context of commodity management to produce a MAGTF product? And if it's truly a MAGTF product, then it's naval integrated product. So that's how I would.
I think another aspect of it is, digitize me, Fred. Galaxy Quest, anybody? We got to digitize our Navy and Marine Corps. And that's not some sort of buzzword. We really, absolutely, fundamentally have to look at all of our capabilities and understand what it means from a digital sense to have, maintain, and sustain that capability. And it starts with the design of the need and the requirements in model-based systems engineering and capabilities-based systems engineering, but then goes all the way to sustainment, where ultimately we should have a digital representation of the configuration of the entire C4I baseline on a DDG for that DDG, so that we know what right looks like, and when it's not right, we can get it back to right. And then in between there is actually fighting the fight. So when you have a system, whether it's an unmanned air vehicle, a surface vehicle, undersea vehicle, or a manned platform, the warfighting information that's coming off of that platform and being transmitted through the RF, whether via cyberspace or space, is on the digital battlefield that we have superiority on and that we understand. What's the answer? I think the way we all get down to common baseline is to understand the native digital aspect of each of the capabilities that we deliver.
Good afternoon. My name is Dave Crocker. I'm with Frontier Technologies. And to the Navy Systems Commanders, I have a question regarding mission threads and the embedded kill chains. And I'm wondering if you can give us an assessment of how mature we are in the unification of your efforts across those mission threads and kill chains to identify the deficiencies that we have, to take a look at the solutions across the MPT&E and actual hardware solutions, and then effectuate your integrated testing that you were alluding to. Are we at a point where truly we're all on the same page? We're developing the specific capabilities that we need based on the deficiencies we have identified, and then are doing testing in an integrated continuum?
I'll start. We're not close to where we need to be. We've had some success, as I alluded to earlier, in the air-to-air environment, which is where we started. My predecessor was a zealot about this for many years, including when he was in your former position down at Cardiff. So we're relatively mature, I'll say, in the air-to-air environment. Over the course of the last 18 months or so, Admiral Mark Dara, who's our Unmanned Systems and Weapons our PEO, has done a great job of coordinating with PEO IWS, Doug Small, in taking that same type of modeling, integration, interoperability work up front on a program, and taking that into the weapons world. Air-to-air weapons, but more importantly now ship-launched weapons. So we've been getting better on that. But I'll say it is not part of our is not part of the Big A acquisition or our big whatever you want to call it, Big B budgeting process. It's right now more of a coalition of the willing as opposed to something that we're having success instantiating in the process. I'm not a zealot like my predecessor on this, but I firmly believe that it's the right way to do business because far too often what we end up delivering to the fleet is not exactly what they need to fill those capability gaps. But it sure looks good on paper.
Okay, any more questions? I think as we close.
You might have one on there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. So I did have a question in terms of sustainment. What are the Syscom communities doing in terms of cyber acquisition and sustainment for, are we pushing or trending towards more virtual and cloud applications for GOTS and COTS? How are we working with the industry to ensure that the maneuverability of cyber applications is sustained?
I invite you to turn to chapter 2, verse 2.
Thank you.
We have a focus on cyber resiliency. Cyber resiliency, what does that mean? Well, it means that we've got to be stronger. We've got to be stronger on the cyber battlefield. And in order to be stronger, we've got to move faster. How do we move faster? In a not so fast, in a not so strong, in a not so good way. There was an article some time ago about how I, as PEOC4I, delivered to my shipmate PEO carriers on our newest class of warship, the USS Gerald R. Ford, Windows XP. Now, why did we do that? Are we a bunch of knuckleheads? No, we actually kind of know what we're doing, but the problem was the system was not set up to move at speed, so we had legacy applications in virtual machines that required XP as their OS, and therefore we had to deliver XP in order to support those legacy systems. How do we disaggregate applications from services, from the infrastructure underneath that, so that we can move applications at application speed, and we can move infrastructure, including the OS and the services associated with it, at the speed necessary to maintain those capabilities without having such a tightly vertically integrated delivery that the integration testing itself takes 12 to 18 months. That's a non-starter. Out there, on that floor, exists today the capability in the commercial world to disaggregate warfighting applications from a warfighting services layer, from an information warfighting platform that will enable us to move at the speed you're talking about. Our struggle is how to be able to implement that and then to deliver it at sea, in expeditionary situations, and through our shore enterprise network now.
Yeah, I'll just say it is a very real challenge for us because we are, as you know, I'm sure, connecting our sustainment tools, capabilities directly to our aircraft. Sometimes direct hardwired connections, sometimes wirelessly. And historically, we have not necessarily in all areas paid the same level of attention to the cyber vulnerability of the platforms versus the support equipment that is now being tied directly to them. So we're paying a great deal of attention to that, and I won't go into any more detail there. But it spreads, that question spreads very, very broadly. Think about another focus area we've got in sustainment right now, which is trying to use additive manufacturing for one-off parts or parts that take a long, long time through traditional manufacturing methodologies or are very expensive. That digital thread from the manufacturing to getting it on an airplane, how do we make sure that that is not vulnerable to nefarious actors? So our sustainment system, folks are paying a tremendous amount of attention to the cyber threat. Whether that's a COTS system or a government-owned system or wherever it came from, we've got the same concerns.
Okay, well, thank you. And you know, we've never not wanted a ready, capable force. How we keep the force ready and what it's ready for is kind of what's changing, and certainly the rate of change is changing in speed. I would add that there's no better metaphor, I think, for where SPAWAR and NAVAIR and NAVSEA come together than through an aircraft carrier. And I was a surface warfare guy, but that is the ultimate open platform, and it's often about how open your platform is to keep up with an evolving threat. And when you want to change the combat system on an aircraft carrier, you launch the old one off the front end, you land a new one on the back end, and it doesn't get more open than that. So we certainly are going to need to keep up with an unknowable future. There are going to be no point threats out there that we can look at and tailor and acquire to. I'm very intrigued with capabilities-based versus requirements-based acquisition, and I hope that's something we can move to. But thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you to you.
Thank you. Well, let me for a moment, on behalf of USNI and FC International, thank our panel. Admiral Carr, thank you very much for putting this together with us. The system commanders obviously have a number of challenges. We're in the right setting to talk those challenges with solution providers. Thank you, Admiral Becker, for pointing to the solution sets that exist right outside this, the curtains here. We're thankful to you for being here with us today, and thankful again to Lockheed Martin for sponsorship. I would like to make a presentation on behalf of USNI and FCA to each member of our panel. The book we're handing is Leader's Bookshelf, and it was written by Admiral Stavridis, who will meet tomorrow, we'll see tomorrow, as he hosts the Senior Service Chief luncheon. We're looking forward to that. I would point out, too, that Hondo Gertz will be our leadoff speaker in the morning, so we can all ask him the tough questions that you asked here today. I think he'd be the first one to say he just uses a system as it exists as opposed to inventing a system. He's a fascinating speaker, and I think you'll find it very entertaining tomorrow. That starts at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow, so we ask you to please join us then. I'd like to present now the Leader's Bookshelf by Admiral Stavridis to each of our members. Once again, let's thank our panel for their words and their insights today. Thank you.
Doctor?